Hi folks, Jim Thompson and Douglas Mackenzie here again for another episode of My Life with Robert Burns. Tonight we're going to be chatting to another of our cronies from across the pond. Our guest tonight is a teacher of theatre in New York City and a long-term fan of our bard, Robert Burns. Tonight, folks, please welcome Thomas Keith.
Thank you very much, Douglas and Jim. Appreciate it. It's an honor to be on your podcast.
Thanks, Thomas. Pleased to meet you. We always start, Thomas, on these podcasts with a simple question. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, please?
Yes, I can. I was born in Cleveland, Ohio, which is where I grew up. I am the fourth of six brothers, and my family is now scattered around the country, living in different places. And I went to college at Ohio University, an undergraduate degree, BFA in theater, and a master's degree in acting, and then headed off to New York City to work as an actor, which I did for about 17 years. What you would call experimental theater in Lower Manhattan, off-Broadway, off-Broadway, as well as some regional theater and summer stock. And I did quite a few commercials and industrials. That was really how I made my living in the acting world. And I was thinking I actually even shot one in London 30 years ago. Got to travel a bit, which was nice. And then I went into publishing, and I was in publishing full-time for only about 8 years. But some of that work carried over into what I do now, because one of my tasks was editing the late work of American playwright Tennessee Williams, as well as shepherding reissues of some of his greatest plays into new editions with new introductions. And that has led to some academia, all kinds of conferences, consulting on film, on theater, and at one point even being involved as a producer for a production. And in 2011, I started teaching. And I work as an associate adjunct professor at Pace University in theater. And that is, I think, the short version.
And we talked about your school. Was there any indication at school that was the direction you'd be going in?
Absolutely. That was what I wanted to do. Yes.
So did that come from show and tell in the very early days?
I don't know. Maybe. I know I went through periods as a child where I decided, that's it, I'm going to be an astronomer. Run around telling everybody. I'd say, no, I'm going to be
interested in stars.
I guess well, not that as much as you'd think. And then I was going to be a gardener or whatever. And at some point in I don't know what age or what the equivalent is in the UK, but in junior high school, when you're about 12, 13, 14, I decided it was an actor, and I stuck with that. And by the way, I should say that I'm not in New York City now. It's 4 years now. 4 years ago, my husband of 25 years, Arturo Noguera, we decided we wanted more space. And so we moved across the river to New Jersey. I don't know if people have been to Manhattan or New York City. There's a good 20-mile stretch of the two states that's separated at the lower end of the Hudson. Yeah. So for those who have been here, as the crow flies, we're right across the river from 67th Street.
I was going to ask about whether or not you studied theater after you left high school.
I'm so sorry. That's what I meant. I studied theater as an undergraduate at Ohio University. That's where I got my BFA. And then I went to graduate school for acting. So I got an MFA in acting. And as we used to say, that stands for Mighty Fine Actor. That and $2.75 will get you on the subway. It's wonderful to have an education, but working as an actor is about all kinds of other things.
And what kind of acting was that you were doing?
I did work in off Broadway theater, in experimental theater, some regional theater, summer stock, and a lot of television commercials.
Yeah, you mentioned the television commercials, and you said you'd done some acting in London. Is there anything in that we would recognize?
No, that was just one commercial shoot. I just got to fly over and shoot at Pinewood Studios, which was fun.
Good.
Now, nobody ever recognizes people from commercials, so.
And did you do a lot more travel as part of your role as an actor?
Some. I did get to travel a bit. There were various trips to the UK, Germany, Greece, Canada, Puerto Rico, where I hadn't been before. So yeah, there was some, and some travel within the US, a little bit.
And you mentioned earlier on, before we started recording, about spending some time in Texas.
That was more recently. That was 2016, where I went as a dramaturg on a production of a Tennessee Williams play. A late, more experimental Tennessee Williams play, and that at the University of Texas in Lubbock, and that was a lot of fun.
Do you have any favorite Tennessee Williams work?
That's a tough one. I've gotten to know his work extremely well. He wrote 33 full-length plays, over 75 one-acts, and volumes of essays, poems, short stories, screenplays, etc. So it's a tough call, but when pressed, I would say that the full-length play, The Night of the Iguana, is probably my favorite. If you remember that one, it was a film with Richard Burton and Ava Gardner and Deborah Carr.
Yeah, I certainly remember the film. It was probably a little bit before my time, mind you.
Me too.
So any other playwrights that you've got a particular interest in?
I do, but because I teach, there's so many playwrights that I know that I need to know. And I've always been a huge fan of Sam Shepard's work, if you've ever heard of him.
Yep.
Might have known him as an actor.
And what kind of age group do you teach? Is it a wide range?
Right now, it's university undergraduate students, so whatever their age range is, 18 to 22.
So we've talked a bit about yourself, Thomas, and obviously we're keen to get to know what your interest in Robert Burns is. So I'll ask Jim to lead the questioning on that.
Robert, as always, Thomas, as always, how did you meet Robert Burns? How did you get involved with Burns in any way?
Well, there's two parts to that. And the first one is that growing up, my grandmother, who lived with us for part of the time, my mother's mother, used to quote Burns. And she used to quote Burns, Robert W. Service, Robert Herrick. And I didn't always know who these poets were or what she was quoting at the time. I learned later. But with Burns, she would quote the things you'd expect. She would say, the best laid schemes of mice and men gang after glee, if something went wrong. Or she would, if something happened, particularly I remember this as a child, that if the adults were noticing something that you did that was silly or they were laughing, you would some point hear my grandmother say, oh, would some power the gifty gie us to see ourselves as others see us. And she was quite feisty, and she was just as apt to knit you a sweater as she was to give you a karate chop between the shoulder blades to get you to stand up straight. And there was something she did that I was thinking about this, and I asked one of my brothers if he could remember, and he couldn't. So I don't know how she did it. And she did it when there was nobody in that area, and it had, I don't know if she did with her foot or her hand, but you'd be stepping up a couple of steps, and she'd do something that would make you take a double step. She didn't trip you, but you'd sort of be surprised and then look, and she'd say, to step aside is human. I think that's some joke she must have had since school age. So that that was my beginning recognition of Burns. And then after I'd moved to New York, I was living above a theater in Lower Manhattan, home on a Saturday, fairly late. It was getting dark, and turned on the radio. And here were these beautiful songs. I didn't know what they were, sung by this amazing voice. And the songs turned out to be the songs of Robert Burns. And the voice was that of Gene Redpath. And I wrote this down, and I began to try to find more recordings of Redpath and to find the lyrics to these songs. And that introduced me to different, I became introduced to the poems and the lyrics by Burns after that, and was just totally fascinated with them. And then I sought out other recordings. Redpath had quite a few. And at that time in used record shops, I found things by people like Ewan McCall, Kenneth McKellar, who I wasn't crazy about then. I think I've grown to appreciate him now. And Bill McHugh, there were a couple albums, and I'm sure there were other people. And this then also sparked something else for me, and that is I'm a bit of a collector. And like a lot of you must have a lot of collectors on here, or know a lot of collectors in the Burns world. And I always say something to the effect that collectors are hoarders with a righteous cause, right? So we're saving things for posterity. And as I was, and there were lots and lots of used bookstores in Manhattan back then, and record stores and everything else. And as I was listening to the Burns songs, reading about Burns, got a biography of Burns, these other bits of ephemera started showing up. Things like Burns supper programs. And I thought, what is this? And announcements of statue unveilings, and advertising, and postcards, and other ephemera relating to Burns. And that really got me going. Then I wanted to know, well, why was everybody, why was there this level of response to this poet? And so that continued well into the 90s. And there were two things that sort of ran concurrently for me. And the first one was I had joined the Burns Federation as an individual, and I got the Chronicle. And on a trip to Scotland in 1989, I got James Mackay's book Burnsiana, which I don't know if you've seen it, but it details all kinds of collectibles and ephemera related to Burns. And so I sort of had a guide as I was hunting for things. And I also wrote to G. Ross Roy down at the University of South Carolina. There was an article about him in the Chronicle, and he was a collector of Burns volumes and lived in the States. And so I wrote to him, and we started corresponding. And eventually, we started talking on the phone. And over the years, I would say there were lots of periods where we spoke at least once a month. And then maybe in the later years, maybe once every 2 months, but fairly regularly. So I think Dr. Roy was a scholar and has a lot of achievements in that area. He also established the Roy collection. But he was also an intense collector, and he just loved hearing about any leads, any possible bits of ephemera that were different or unusual. And that's a lot of what our conversations were about. And when I talked to him about the statues, he said, well, you have to get in touch with Jim Mackay. So I wrote to James Mackay, and we started corresponding. And then I met Jim and his wife, Renata, on a trip to New York, when they took a trip to New York. And then I met Ross and his wife, Lucy, when they took a trip to New York. And there was a conference coming up that was being thrown by Ross and Patrick Scott at the University of South Carolina in 1996. And Ross kept asking me, are you going to give a paper? And when he first said that, I thought, I didn't know what he was talking about. And then he explained it to me, and he kept asking. And I felt I never studied anything like that. And the whole notion of academia was on the other side of a wall, and I didn't really know what it was. And I used to refer to myself as a civilian. I wasn't, that was not what I did. And he kept pressing me, and I finally just said, I'm not doing this. I'll go, I'll see what it's all about. And I ended up doing a small display case with images of the Burns cottage reproduced in various ways that Patrick Scott helped me with. And anyway, so I went to this conference, and it was fascinating because, and I'm sure you've been to these at Strathclyde or the Mitchell or
Yep.
University of Glasgow. And it was, some of the theoretical work I didn't entirely understand. Some of it I found boring. Most of it I found fascinating, whether it was historical or text-based. I think that's where I met Ken Simpson and Jerry Carruthers, and maybe Bill Dawson. I can't remember if that's where I met Bill. He would know. And but the one thing about that conference that really stuck with me is there was a professor named Donald Lowe, if you remember
Yep.
Dr. Lowe. And up to that point, I had done all my reading about Burns by myself. There weren't that many people to talk to about it. And I talked to Ross a little bit. But I had loved To a Mouse. I still think it's a piece of perfection. And I knew about it when I was younger, and then I studied it a little more, and I recited it and all that. And then I read To a Mountain Daisy. And I thought, it's trying a little too hard here. It just seemed a little saccharine, and he was trying to do, have the same success, but not on as strong a subject. And then I read On Seeing a Wounded Hare Limp By, is that the title of it? And thought, well, now he's gone too far. This is really, he's trying too hard. It's too sentimental. It's like a knockoff. And at the conference, must have been, in the early 90s. And at the conference, Dr. Lowe gave a talk on that poem. And he went over line by line, and he explicated some things, and he gave context to the whole thing, and he talked about Burns' intentions in the line. And at the end of his session, which was only 15 or 20 minutes, he then recited all of On Seeing a Wounded Hare Limp By. And I thought, that's a beautiful poem. Why didn't I see that? And that's one of the wonderful things about scholarship and about these conferences. Not only do you learn new things, but it's like lifting a veil for me on things that I think I know. And even things that I've studied, I find out more about them by going to these conferences whenever I can. And most of them are in Scotland. So that was a terrific experience. And Ross was, pushing me to write. And I wrote a few things for the Burns Chronicle back then. I'm trying to think what else. Oh, I sent Peter Westwood a couple dozen postcards for his book on postcards. I had quite a few by then. And then they have these things called elder hostels, which are classes for people over 50, 55 or retired in everything you can think of. Every kind of, from scuba diving to basket weaving. They have these classes that people can do. And they needed someone at a monastery up the Hudson River here to take over a class on Burns. And someone recommended me. And I probably learned more about the text in those 5 years than I had before, because when you have to teach somebody, you have to understand it yourself. And so that was a great experience.
That's amazing. That all of a sudden from a monastery way upriver came the opportunity to teach Burns. That just amazing.
Well, it was wonderful. And I don't think it's in print anymore, but I ended up putting together, I was in publishing toward the end of that, and I self-published a little edition of Burns. And the reason I did it was because I could pick the poems and I could put a glossary across the page. Because the notion that you're going to get somebody excited about Burns in the States without some help right there, as opposed to having to flip to the back or the bottom, seemed a little too much for me. So I did that. And then there was a conference in 2001 that Ross asked me to give a talk at. It was in Atlanta. It was sponsored by the Burns Federation, University of South Carolina, and I think Emory University and the Atlanta Burns Club, which is where, by the way, I met Frank and Susan Shaw, who then later asked me to give an immortal memory at the Atlanta Burns Club, which was lovely. And the talk was on the statues of Robert Burns in North America. And by then, I had gathered a lot of information and had been writing and corresponding for almost 10 years with chambers of commerce, art museums, different kind of local Burns organizations to get information on all these statues. I think now there are 16 in the United States.
Yeah, there are 16.
Quite a lot.
Yeah.
And then I ended up giving that talk and then writing it out. And that was probably the most comprehensive article on the statues, or the North American statues up to that time. So there's also another track that overlaps this one, which I think is worth mentioning. And that is that I went to a Burns supper in New York for the first time, 92, 93, something like that. And when they got to the toasts, oh, it must have been 93. It's a standard in most Burns suppers in the US that you toast the Queen of England and toast the president, and then the other toasts. And whoever was doing it that day didn't want to toast the president, who was Bill Clinton, who had been inaugurated the week before. So, well, we're not going to bother with him. We'll toast to George H.W. Bush. And I really didn't like that. I didn't like the politics infused into it. I just thought if this is a tradition and we do this, we should just do it. And so I was looking around for Burns suppers, and I found an LGBT Scottish group. Of course, it's New York City, so there was one. And it was called, first it was called Clan na Broge, Nabro, I think, IG. And there was a big disagreement about whether that meant the right thing in Gaelic. So then they changed it to Clan Anur, and that's Uabhair. And no one could ever agree on whether it meant family of pride or family of arrogance. So I never used it. I'm not a Gaelic speaker anyway, but it was, I just say the gay and lesbian Scottish group. And so I met them and said, have you ever had a Burns night? And they said, no. And I said, well, why don't we put on a Burns night? So that was quite an education. There was a group of us, and I wrote down their names because I didn't want to forget them. It was Ian Betts, Mark McGee, Peggy Hughes, Elaine Sutherland, Martin Adam, and Bill Burt. And a lovely couple named Ann Hankins and Jack Cole, who maybe not that first year, but in about 16 of the years, would come and teach everybody Scottish country dancing who didn't know it, and run the dancing after the dinner. And that was really, it was an education, but it was also the guy who founded the group had a difficult situation. I won't go into the details, with an Irish group that didn't want him there because he identified as being, having Scottish heritage. So and this was actual Irish people as well as Irish Americans. But anyway, neither here nor there. There was a point made that this group was open to everybody. And so it was the most diverse Burns supper that I've ever been to on a regular basis. And over the years, most of the people, not most, but like 40 to 50% of the people who attended would identify as heterosexual. You had people bringing their children. There was always a table full of French people every year. It's New York. African Americans came, all kinds of different people who identified in different ways. And there was not overemphasis on clans and tartans. It was like, whatever your nationality, come to the Burns supper. And we had a lot of Burns poetry and Burns songs in the program, because that's the part that I curated. But we also had poems by American poets and different Scottish poets, and tried to sort of have it be an opportunity to learn about new poets. And we also changed the toasts. I thought, I'm dispensing with the president. We're getting rid of the president. And so the people who I could get to volunteer, or who I would coax into giving toasts, I'd say you can give a toast to the Queen of England, or to the Queens, whatever that meant as far as gay men and lesbians was, or to the borough of Queens. Because, Manhattan, New York City is made up of 5 boroughs. Manhattan, the Bronx, Staten Island, Brooklyn, and Queens. And so there was that. And people picked whatever they liked. Sometimes they picked all 3. And then I had always, I don't know how to say this, like, bristled is not the right word, but I never really responded well to the toast to the lassies and the lassies' reply. I thought it was a little chauvinist, and the whole thing got a little too cute, unless the women who volunteered for their toast were really good. Do you know what I mean? With the sort of the flirtatiousness and everything. So we altered that to be the toast to the laddies and the laddies' reply. And then we switched it up, and it became the toast to the laddies and the toast to the lassies. And every year we switched whether a laddie or a lassie gave which one, which turned out to be wonderful because, and I'm sure these happen at Burns suppers anyway, but because so much of Burns' life was fraternal, and he had these great friendships, and he was a Mason and everything else, the toast to the laddies from a laddie made perfect sense. And then in terms of the woman's role, women toasting the women also made sense. And so that was a lot of fun. And then for the music, we didn't have any money. And we'd found most of our spaces were in churches. And we finally found at First Presbyterian Church on Fifth Avenue, they had a volunteer organization that would cook meals for occasions and donate all the money to a homeless shelter that was also run by the church. And so they ended up doing our cooking, which was wonderful. And in terms of finding people who knew the instruments, we always had great pipers. There were always pipers around in New York. It was a little tougher. And so what I found is that if I said to people, well, here's a tune or a song I think might be right for you, can you bring your tradition, whatever that is, to it? Which was so successful that it led to 10 or 11 years of Scottish music nights. And some of it was inspired. Do you remember Maxine Sullivan had a swing version of Loch Lomond that was very successful? So if somebody sang opera, they would bring that. If somebody sang country western, they would bring that. Rock, punk rock, folk, jazz. And sometimes it didn't work, but mostly it did work. And it was amazing how well it worked. And so that was really nice because, again, if it was only, whatever my idea of traditional might be, I don't think it would have spoken to as many people as it did. So that was a lot of fun and also a lot of work. I'm sure everybody in Burns' organization in Scotland knows that. And the Burns suppers went through 2013. So I'm doing this, getting into the scholarship, dipping my foot in that, still collecting, helping out with Burns suppers. And then after that Atlanta conference, Ken Simpson invited me to the Strathclyde conference, which was a lot of fun. And it was early 2002. And it was especially nice for me because it was a dual conference. One was at the Mitchell and one was in Belfast. So I got to go over to Northern Ireland. And then after that, I think I skipped something. I'm trying to go chronologically. That's easiest for me to not forget things. I also then, in 2004, published an article in Studies in Scottish Literature for Ross, and it's a discography of Robert Burns. And I had been researching and collecting sound recordings of Burns, and they were from 1948 to, I think, 2003. With a kind of a lengthy introduction. And I don't remember the exact number, about 200 at that time. And that that was a lot of work, but also satisfying, a lot of fun. And then after that, either Ken or Jerry would invite me every other year, every so often. I didn't look up what years, but to Strathclyde or to the University of Glasgow. And I know the last time I gave a talk at the University of Glasgow was 2012. And it's like water in the desert for me because you don't, I mean, there's been a few conferences here and they're always in South Carolina or Atlanta, but you don't get them everywhere in New York or in the States. And so getting to go to Scotland to attend them is, I really enjoy it. And I went in 2019 was the last one. I went down to one of the ones they now have at the cottage in Alloway as an attendee. I didn't give a talk or anything. But I was
coming back to your work on cataloging all the recordings. Are these recordings still available, or are many of them been lost in the mists of time?
Most of them are somewhere available. Some are harder to find than others. A lot of them I own, and I have all the LPs, CDs, cassettes, and even a couple of 8-track tapes.
Yeah.
And I don't find new ones too often now. I find maybe once or twice a year. And I mean, the list, I haven't looked, but it's probably up to, I mean, I keep track of them, but it's probably up to 300, 350 now. Because there was really a blossoming frankly, after the Redpath Hovey recordings in the 70s and 80s, and all of those recordings she did with Donald Lowe, and heading up to the 96th, the bicentenary of his death, there was an explosion of Burns albums. And then, of course, the Lynn Project, which is tremendous.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think people can find them. The article's easy to find. It's on Studies, and Patrick has all SSL online.
Yeah.
And and as I said, it only goes up to 2004 or 3. But yeah, you can find them, and some of them, if they're a little harder to find, you can find them on eBay. You know, some of them I found in I wish I could. There used to be like an underground arcade right near Buchanan Street.
Yeah.
Does that ring a bell?
Yeah, I know the one you mean.
Yeah, it's gone. See, I don't go enough to keep up with when changes take place, but I found a few down there. But there's certainly, you can find them, and a lot of them have been transferred to CD.
Yeah. So what's the earliest recording you've got?
Well, I have some 78s, which I didn't include in that. There's one from late 20s, early 30s, where was it Ramsay MacDonald, the Prime Minister, gives a talk on Burns. And there are a lot of, I looked up, and the information is roughly in the discography mentioned in the intro, but I did searches in libraries, dozens of online searches back then, to see what they had in terms of those amber roll records, the round records, and the 78s. 20 years later, that's going to be a much bigger list, and it's a lot of work, so I'm not ready to go back and do that. But you can find them. But as far as my earliest, somewhere in there, I have a couple 78s, but you got to draw the line somewhere. So
having listened to all of these recordings, do you have a favorite Burns song?
I do. It's hard to pick a favorite Burns poem or a favorite Burns song, but I've seen you ask this of other people on this podcast, so I was prepared. And well, now as soon as you've asked me, I want to prevaricate because there's so many. I should have picked 10, but I was thinking about it, and the one that came to mind was Song Composed in August. Now Westland Winds.
Yeah.
And I like it on 2 counts. One, that he starts in nature and man's relationship to nature, obviously Westling Winds and Slaughtering Guns both show up in Autumn, and describes that relationship. And then when he brings his love into it, his romance with Peggy, they're part of the whole bucolic picture. They're not separate from it. And it's just a dear song. It's simpler in many ways, and I know it's an early lyric of his, maybe less sophisticated than some, but I like it a lot, and there's so many good recordings of it. I think, who does it on the Lynn records? I want to say Ian Bruce. It's really good.
Well, Ian Bruce is certainly on some of these CDs in that set. This is where Jim normally goes to his bookcase and gets the set out. But
I've flogged it that much. People are fed up looking at it. For me, if you're a Bunsian, it's just quintessential in terms of the music.
Oh, absolutely. And I did think of a favorite poem because, again, if I wasn't ready, it would be you'd have dead air. And again, that's hard to do. But there's one that always has sparked my interest greatly, and I've responded to it and have an odd little connection to. When I was a kid, I used to work on the family genealogy with my grandmother, the same grandmother I mentioned earlier. And we would go to libraries and different sources and look things up. And she also had a fair amount of family material from her side of the family that had come down for a while, for many years. And, lists, there were invitations to a Halloween party that my great-grandfather wrote, and they're in the Standard Habby, which is interesting. And I don't think he had a drop of Scottish blood. And, letters between my great-grandparents and genealogy and that. And there was also this little torn piece of paper where one of my relatives hand wrote a stanza in quotations, but it had no attribution. And the woman who wrote it was Hannah Austin Van Winkle. She's part Welsh, Scottish, Dutch, and she married Zenas Pierce, also Welsh and Scottish. And they were farmers in northern Pennsylvania. She lived from 1833 to 1903. And years later, I still have the scrap of paper in a box here, I came across to the Reverend John McMath enclosing a copy of Holy Willie's Prayer, which he had requested. And the stanza that she wrote down was, God knows I'm no the thing I should be, nor am I even the thing I could be. But 20 times I rather would be an atheist clean than under gospel colors hid be just for a screen. And I find that fascinating, that the quote is not from To a Mouse or something else, but it's a stanza about hypocrisy. And these are very religious people too. It's not some political or statement or something. So that's a terrific poem. He really gets intense there.
And a bit, to be honest, a bit it's delusional because, the stuff about Gavin Hamilton, just, it isn't worth thinking about how Burns has been conned by Gavin Hamilton, and he thinks he's a wonderful person. However, I'm sitting here looking at you, and right behind your head I can see the 4 volumes of the H&H Centenary Edition, which are sitting in my bookcase as well, I've got to say, and there's a whole lot of other stuff. How much of a collection have you got in terms of,
Well, I've sort of stripped back. The Henley and Henderson, a friend gave me a long time ago. There was every kind of bookshop you can imagine in Manhattan. It was amazing. And there was a Celtic bookshop, and those were on sale there. I have donated a lot of stuff to the University of South Carolina and other places, and I give it away if I can find home. I'm a bit of there's too much. So now you have about 5 shelves of really solid Burns research books, and then other things scattered around, like collectible things. somewhat rarer things. I was going to say, one of the reasons I love Reverend John McMath, and I looked at several of the poems about the church, was that Jerry Carruthers invited me to write a chapter for the Oxford Burns Handbook. And I wrote something called Burns Among the American Abolitionists, about mostly about Frederick Douglass, the American abolitionist who you will know. And he was a huge fan of Burns. As you know, he was a slave and then bought his freedom eventually. This is a short version. And then became a famous orator and speaker and writer. And the first earnings that he had after he was in the North, he used them to buy a copy of Burns' poems. He was a big Burns fan. And one of the things he connected with about Burns, in addition to his perceived understanding of the worth of the individual, which I think is how a lot of people received Burns, particularly because of A Man's a Man, was Burns' vocal relationship to the church and challenging the church, because that was one of the problems. You know, they ended slavery much earlier in the UK. And one of the problems here was that as long as the ministers of any denomination or the rabbis were not condemning slavery in the pulpit, if the church doesn't condemn it, then what do I have to worry about? And so it ties in with that whole subject.
It's interesting you mentioned Frederick Douglass, because he appears in the documentary Burns in the USA, which you also appeared in as well. Can you tell us how that came about?
I did appear in it without my little goatee. I don't remember who might have recommended me, but I was contacted by the producer. I mean, the odds are it was Patrick Scott or Jerry. That would be the most. They were talking to all kinds of people in the New York City area. And it was fun. It was interesting. You know, of course, they use a lot less than ends up being in the documentary. But I got to talk about a couple things, the statues a little bit, as well as the ephemera and the various things. I forgot to mention I co-wrote a book on Mauchlinware that was published in 2002, which is Burns got me into that. And so I was able to show quite a few things. And then I talked a little bit about Auld Lang Syne and that, and it's not a specialized subject. A lot of people know the story and it's been well written about. But one of the reasons that it's sung on New Year's, because it hadn't been sung on New Year's prior as often prior to the 1920s, was because of Guy Lombardo. And then it started being used in the movies. And once things are in the movies, then, you know, people copy them. But apparently there were other songs that even closed Burns nights in the 19th century. I think Clark McGinn would be the person to talk to about that if you haven't spoken to him yet.
It's interesting that you mentioned statues as one of the things that came out in the documentary, and you said you'd collected some books on statues. Have you had the opportunity to visit many of these statues? Not
as many as I would like to. I don't know what the number would be. I remember James Mackay had great stories, because he used to, as editor of the Chronicle, travel and he would take buses everywhere, and he visited all of them that were extant at that time. No, I haven't been to Wyoming. I haven't been to Colorado. I'm trying to think. I did see there was one in St. Louis that's wonderful, and there's a strange looking one in San Francisco. I was just fascinated by the number of statues relative to other people.
Yeah.
If you get outside of religious or military figures, into the arts, say, there are a lot of statues in the United States from every ethnic group you can think of course. Goethe and Schiller both have quite a few. There's a Polish General Pulaski, Lafayette, there are a lot of statues, but those are military. But in the realm of literature, there are more statues to Burns than anybody else.
Yeah, I mean, I had to write a piece for my the hospital where my daughter worked, which by coincidence was called Fellow Mortals. And they were interested in the link with Robert Burns. So I wrote a piece for the website and discovered that there were 60 statues throughout the world. I think there might be more now. But the only people other than religious figures, the only people that had more statues were Queen Victoria and Christopher Columbus.
Who, yeah, are sort of political in a sense, yeah.
Yeah. So
well, yes, political. That was the other one. Like there are more statues of Abraham Lincoln in this country than anyone.
Yeah.
Or Columbus, excuse me. I think it's Columbus and then Lincoln, and then it goes from there.
Yeah.
But Burns is quite a lot, and there are not that many of Shakespeare. There are a few of Sir Thomas More, not that many. And so I was interested in why this was the case. And people would say, oh, because he's a great poet. And I would think, well, that can't be, that's not all. And I think that in the States, and I know this was the case for me growing up, even though we have some Scots descent, the Scots had always sort of been lumped in with the English, except for Pipes and Tartan and the sort of, the Harry Lauder recognizable Scottish stereotypes. And they frequently went to church together. But I think because the English were dominant, they didn't need to put up statues of anybody. But other ethnicities did. And I think that you also had lots of Scots who became the captains of industry, belonged to Masonic groups, belonged to Burns societies. And after you've had so many golf games and so many St. Andrews dinners, what do you do next? Well, a lot of them said this, we've got to do this to show our pride and our heritage, is put up a statue of Burns. It wasn't the case with all of them. Some of them were individuals who raised the money, had the money or raised the money to put up the statues. But I think it says something, it's a sort of a snapshot of immigration from about 1880 to 1930 and where the Scots fell into that picture in the US and Canada, which was quite prominent.
Certainly, I mean, I discovered the one in Central Park looking for strawberry fields, because George Harrison had just died when we were there, and I was trying to find that, and I found the statue of Burns in Central Park. And I mean, I've been them all over the world, and I keep finding them by accident mostly. But there's quite a few in America that I need to go and see. The one in San Francisco is not very good though.
No, he's a little stiff.
It's
odd. He also, like some of the proportions are odd in all of them. The Central Park one was roundly criticized when it went up by art critics because it's not quite in the right proportion, and because he's looking up, he looks a little limp, and they didn't like that. He's composing, and his hand is sort of over the stump, and they thought, no, that's not.
Thomas, a wee birdie, one of my informants tell me you've been doing stuff recently with Patrick for publication. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, I have been working on an article for Studies in Scottish Literature since the spring. And it came about because Jerry Carruthers and Ian Brown edited a volume, Performing Robert Burns. And I thought this would be right up my alley. There's so many things that I've been researching and collecting having to do with Robert Burns and performance. And I found out about it in 2018, and I could have thrown my hat in the ring whether they would have accepted me or not, but I didn't do it because I still had to finish the article on Burns and Frederick Douglass. And then the volume came out in January, and I was sort of skimming articles at first and then reading them a little more carefully. And by the way, it's a terrific volume. I highly recommend it. But from the introduction to the chapters on plays, I only found about 6 Burns titles, 6 or 7 plays about Burns. And I was speaking to Patrick and I said, I must have that many on my shelf or more. And then, I don't know if it was a month later, I had found about 15, either I have the copies or I had photocopies of them that I had made in University of South Carolina in 2004. And I thought there must be more. And I started looking and finding more and finding more. And Patrick said, well, if you want to write this as an article, it would be an interesting research topic and kind of like the discography. And I thought I didn't particularly want to be the person who wrote about any of the individual plays, but I thought if I have this information as much as I can, and I can put it in an article, it's going to be a resource for scholars to write about all kinds of things. And so what I try to include wherever possible is the date of the original performance of the play, if it was performed, the date of publication, if it was published, where the manuscript is housed, if there's a manuscript and it wasn't published, and then for each play, whatever I could find based on that information or reviews, and I did most of this, it was last spring and summer when things were still pretty well locked down, I did searching on the internet. And I wrote to a few different archives in Missouri, South Carolina, New York, and in Scotland, the National Library and Glasgow. And I found 90 plays.
Wow.
Either about Burns or about his influence. And that includes musicals and things that are called operas or folk operas. Because there was so much information, I did not include any adaptations of his work. So there's no Cotter's Saturday Night or The Holy Fair or Tam O'Shanter, or there's a lot of his poetry that has been adapted for the stage or for pantomimes or that kind of thing. And I didn't include the Love and Liberty, the Jolly Beggars. Again, has been staged quite a bit. And I found it so much fun. And because it really, in some respect, it's like collecting when you do research. You're finding and gathering the information, but in this case, you don't necessarily need to take up any space because it's all electronic. And so I really like the hunt of research, finding the information. And I found about 12 plays that were intriguing, but I didn't have quite enough information, so I just listed them at the end. So I'm sure there are more. If there were time to travel and to get out, I'm sure that there are more plays about Burns. But once again, and this is I think it's consistent in what I've written, is that I'm looking at the reception of Burns as well as the creative responses to Burns. So Burns inspires that in a way, to write plays about him, to record albums of his songs, to perform him in some way, going on however many years it's been.
That's going to be fascinating. Just remind us again when it's going to get published.
It's going to be online at the end of the year. And then I think the physical volume comes out next year.
Look forward to that.
Well, thank you. Have we come to the end?
Not quite.
Well, normally in this programme, I don't let people escape without a wee bit of poetry or a song. And given that you've mentioned 2 or 3 of Burns's, your grandma has mentioned 2 or 3 of Burns's great poems, I'd just like you to have the opportunity, if you wish, to maybe do a verse or 2.
I will give you the standard here. I'm going to open it just in case I forget the words. I think I know them. And I will preface, which, I think more people should do it, at events where there are Scots, I'm doing my best. They're just, I mean, you don't have to attempt a Scots accent, but certain level of pronunciation helps the rhythm, you know? So for better or worse. So this is to a mouse or te a mouse, or I've heard some people say te a moose, and I think that must be depending on where they lived in Scotland. Oh, and here first is a wee beastie. This is Doc, the man who must be obeyed. Wee sleekit coorin timorous beastie. Oh, what a panic's in thy breastie. Thou need not start to was a hasty with bickering brattle. I would be loath to run and chase thee with murdering paddle. And then this is in English. I'm truly sorry man's dominion has broken nature's social union and justifies that ill opinion which makes thee startle at me, thy poor earth-born companion and fellow mortal. I doubt no while but thou may thieve. What then? Poor beastie, thou man live. A damonicker in a thrave's a small request. I'll get the blessing with the lave and never missed. Thy wee bit hussy, too, in ruin. Its silly was, the winds are strewing, and nothing now to big a new one of foggage green. And bleak December's winds ensuing, baith snell and keen. Thou saw the field laid bare and wast, and weary winter coming fast, and cozy there, beneath the blast thou thought to dwell, till crash, the cruel coulter passed out through thy cell. That wee bit heap o' leaves and stibble has cost thee money, a weary nibble. Now thou's turned out for all thy trouble, but house or hold, to thole the winter's sleety dribble and cranrick cold. But Moosey, thou art know thy lane, in proving foresight may be vain. The best laid schemes o' mice and men gang off to gley and leave us naught but grief and pain for promised joy. Still, thou art blessed compared with me. The present only toucheth thee. But I'd backwards cast my ee on prospects drear. And forward, though I canna see, I guess and fear.
Well done, and I've got to say,
Thank you.
with some hypocrisy, you wouldn't know you were an actor.
You did, yeah. But boy, he was having a hard time when he wrote that.
Well, allegedly written in a day as he's ploughing the field, and the boy who had the battle was the first witness to it.
Yeah, when people talk about Burns, dealing with depression, it's not a surprise.
That was fantastic, Thomas. Well done, well done. And your accent just added to it. It was tremendous. And thanks for Doc's help. And,
he's happy to help. He's going on 16, and he just wakes up from time to time and comes over to and then you see his friend Sammy is back here sleeping this whole time.
Tremendous. So their assistance in allowing you to tell the story of your life with Robert Burns was tremendous. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen.